It was another Monday morning. The sign on the door said private investigator, but the sign below that said closed, and I was saying yes to a third cup of coffee. It was cold and bitter, like an all-critical Patch Tuesday. My partner was out of town, looking into a street racing ring, but that was like building a Linux desktop. Lots of customizations and too many questionable drivers. When a regex walked in, I sighed. They usually fit a pattern of long on stories and short on cash. I need to find something, they said. Why don't you start at the end, I suggested, hoping to hear a dollar sign. It's a long story, they continued, with a lot of greedy characters. I knew those types too. Then start at the beginning, but give me a carrot to follow. They paused, then asked, will you treat this case as sensitive? I nodded, and they proceeded to tell me their story, one line at a time. Which means, this week, we chat with Josh Goldberg about security from a developer's perspective and how security messages can be part of regular developer education. In the news segment, Citrix bleeds, Atlassian warns, bounties pay, Microsoft secures the future, and more. Find a pattern and stay tuned for Application Security Weekly.
This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals.
It's the show to learn the latest tools and techniques to understand DevOps, applications, and the cloud. Your trusted source for the latest Appsec news. It's time for Application Security Weekly.
Hi folks, I'm Adrian Sanabria, the host of Enterprise Security Weekly. Every week, we interview the most interesting folks we can find, talking about the most pressing cybersecurity issues and challenges facing the enterprise today. Myself and my co-hosts have each been in the industry for decades, long enough to see the patterns in the industry and explore where trends are going. In addition to enterprise challenges, we also follow the vendor space, the most interesting security startups emerging, technology and product trends, all of the most interesting funding and acquisition announcements. Finally, we love to discuss the latest trends in tech and how they'll impact cybersecurity. If you're wondering how the latest in AI, quantum computing, cloud, and DevOps is going to impact security a few years down the road, you should follow the Enterprise Security Weekly podcast.
This is episode 262, recorded November 6, 2023. I'm your host, Mike Shima. John is off this week, and we have Lee Neely with us. Hello, Lee.
Hi, Mike. Hi, Josh. It's good to be here. What a great way to spend a Monday morning talking about some really cool app security stuff. I'm looking forward to a great conversation.
As we are. You can also look forward, Lee, to finding us on Instagram because we have highlight reels, giveaway announcements, and more at Sec Weekly. Yeah. And Josh, as mentioned, is a front-end developer with a passion for open source, static analysis, and the web. He's the author of Learning TypeScript and a full-time open source maintainer who contributes regularly to TypeScript and the open source projects in its ecosystem. His past work includes spearheading Code Academy's usage of TypeScript and helping create its Learn TypeScript course. Also, architecting rich client applications at Microsoft. His projects range from static analysis, pretty cool, to meta languages, also cool, to recreating retro games in the browser, which sounds really cool to me. I like that part. Hello, Josh. Thank you for joining us again.
Hello. Thank you for getting through that intro. I appreciate it. How's it going?
It is going well, and we have had you on a couple times now on a theme of giving presentations. And the idea is that we have a lot of AppSec conferences and a lot of AppSec people giving AppSec presentations to AppSec audiences. But maybe we should be talking to developers a little bit more. And if we're going to talk to developers, maybe we should have some good presentation skills. So that's been kind of the theme we've been doing. And Josh, we have you back. You were recently talking to some developers about static analysis, but not perhaps so much from a security angle. Maybe tell us a little bit about that. And we're curious, what is it like talking to developers? They seem such a strange audience for us AppSec folks.
Sure. I think there are a lot fewer differences between AppSec folks and developer folks than one might initially think. But yeah, what I generally talk about, one of my main topics is static analysis, the art of looking at your code and scrutinizing it, coming up with suggestions or fixes without actually running it. And that's broadly universally applicable, whether you're looking for general code bugs like asynchronous code defects or specifically security issues like looking at regular expressions and finding redos vulnerabilities. So for any presentation, I try to figure out what does the audience already know? What do they want to get out of the presentation? Or what can I give them out of it? And then what's the shortest path between those two sets of points? How do we get to that point with as little hubbub and hullabaloo as possible?
So I love the idea of going in with a plan. This is what I want to convey. This is what I want to teach, and mostly sticking to that. Now, I want to come back to how presentations evolve once you're live and giving them. But you were talking about static analysis, but this was, I think, static analysis that wasn't explicitly security, right? This is more like linting, formatting. Tell us a little bit about that aspect of it that you were focused on.
Yeah. There are kind of three general areas of tooling that folks in my areas of the web ecosystem, JavaScript, TypeScript, and so on, generally tend to use. There's the formatter, which just quickly reformats your code. It helps you save time having to type out tab or space as much as you might need. There's the linter, which finds likely issues, little stylistic inconsistencies, or small bugs. And then there's the type checker, something like TypeScript, which will check for correctness, not necessarily stylistic consistency. And all three of those things are separate, unique, and beautiful in their own way, and they can each catch bugs, help you develop a little faster. So they're general purpose tools that can be applied to stuff like security testing or bug fixing or developer speed-ups with the formatter. But the general principles of them are pretty shared across ecosystems and languages.
And part of the reason I was focusing a little bit on that static analysis point, especially the linter formatter, is that I'm a firm believer that code quality leads to secure code. I think a lot of what you're describing, just formatting, consistent style, makes it also very readable, which I think just contributes to security. Because I'm pretty sure even in your background, you're not the only one developing code. You actually work with teams, right? Other people have to read what you write?
Unfortunately for them, yes. And I absolutely agree. The vast majority of your time, quote unquote, writing code is likely not actually the writing of the code. It's the discussing it, the reading other people's code, the reading about how to write code, the investigating bugs. So the more readable your code can be, the better it is for you.
So hang on a second. I'm getting a secondary message here, and that is, if I show up to the table and I talk about all things security, beginning, ending, and flowing through security, I'm not going to get the same reception as if I come up with a tool to help, a way that not only helps them write better code and makes their lives better, but also makes my life better as the security guy. Or am I making that up?
It sounds right to me. I think, as with any topic, you got to have a hook in there, something that makes the people you're talking to excited about it, or at least make them think, okay, this is relevant to me and useful. So if you're talking to security folks about why to use a formatter, you might put something forward like more readable code is more understandable code and less likely to have weird little issues. So that, I think you bring up a really good point of tailoring it to the people you're talking to.
So, wait, you mean I got to talk in relevant language to the person I'm talking to? What the hell, man?
I'm so sorry. Awful.
Yeah, sorry, Lee. No more reading off top 10 lists. We don't do that anymore.
Next thing you know, you're going to tell me that I can't use ChatGPT. Actually, that would be an interesting. Okay, that was a snide remark, but how, is it too soon to ask how the Gen AI, et cetera, that whole much, has that made enough impact for you to say how it looks like it's going to impact this world moving forward? Is it too soon?
I use it as a utility. I don't use it as the main paintbrush, so to speak. I will sometimes, if I'm having problems figuring out a talk or a CFP proposal or something, I'll use it to suggest things, but it doesn't quite get my tone right, no matter how hard I try. And I generally like rewriting things that other folks or tools give me anyway. So I wouldn't use it primarily, but definitely secondarily.
Yes, I'm just thinking, were there any wins yet? I agree. Sometimes you can ask the generative AI engine some question about something to get unstuck. If your brain's wedged, it's totally cool. Research is research. You need it where you can find it, not just Stack Overflow. But I'm just thinking, is it shown up in the analysis part of the tool side as yet, or is it too early? I'm guessing it's a little too early. Although I bet people are working like crazy on it.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It's almost a third category. We have dynamic analysis, things like tests. You have static analysis, things like linters and type checkers. And then you have, I don't know what to call it, artificial intelligence, generative analysis, something like that. Something that operates at a level kind of between the two, perhaps.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I see a lot of the the LLMs are trained on what has come before them. So from my perspective there, the scanners, the linters, formatters, they are the bespoke, custom, design fit for purpose, designed to find these issues, where the LLMs so far are just going to interpret and see what they might make up or what they might find. I thought there was an interesting angle on, less so on the static analysis side perhaps, but Josh was sort of describing perhaps creating an abstract. Here is, how do I get from idea past a blank page into talking to developers? And I think you mentioned, Josh, that generative AI is not going to capture your tone. Totally agree with that. You want to be genuine. I'm also curious about, I don't think it's going to grab an audience's attention. And we started off too, and Lee was helping us figure out that, we have to give relevant information to developers. I'm curious, if you were to take this, linter and formatting and add explicitly a security analysis tool to your presentation, what in your presentation would have changed? What would you have done different when you're talking explicitly about that?
It's a great question. It depends on the security folks I'm talking to, even. It's not like there is a security person and that is the persona. But speaking in the abstract, I try to link it into things that are actually useful. So in this case, the really common example, something that a linter is particularly good at, is finding regular expressions that could be, what is the term? Regular expression denial of
REDOS.
service?
Yes,
REDOS?
exactly.
Yes. That's one of my favorite linter plugins for ESLint, the standard JavaScript TypeScript linter. You can find those. And then I might also tie into the higher level practices around bugs. Generally, bugs cause security defects sometimes, and at the very least make it harder to write secure, stable software. So showing that you can have linter rules that find, let's say, asynchronous tasks that are created and mishandled, or created and never handled. That type of stuff can be generally applicable, and particularly for security folks. And then what we were talking about earlier of it's not just the technical finding bugs or finding vulns, it's also the team processes, the ways that you can help standardize documentation on your team, like with a good type system that can make it a lot easier for folks to communicate, even if they're not actually talking to each other.
So well formatted, documented. These are things that I love hearing. But what has been your experience in the uptake of that? So in here, I don't want to say, I do want to push back against the idea that developers don't care about security. I do imagine that they're also protective of their time, and maybe not everybody enjoys the documentation. So as we talk about, trying to get actionable takeaways, convince an audience to follow up, as you're talking to developers, what have you found successful? What have you found the ways that they're like, oh, that does make sense. That helps me in this way.
There's a great phrase that's been bouncing around for a while now, pit of success. You want people to fall into the successful ways and make it harder to climb out and go into the unsuccessful ones. So TypeScript, I think, is a really good example of that, where the type system is so beneficial that it can catch bugs, make it easier to develop, to refactor, to read code, that people don't realize that they're actually documenting code as they type it. They're documenting what's a string, what's an array of objects, what's, and so on and so forth. So finding ways to primarily serve people's needs that immediately help them, and then also tie it into the larger, more indirect needs, such as documentation. That tends to be much more successful than just pointing a finger at someone and saying, you should now spend extra time at this thing that we are implying you never cared about. Because it's not that developers are lazy. It's that we're always pressed for time. There's never enough time for anything. So we're going to get the shortest path to our goals as possible.
No, and I think part of that sounded like, too, the shortest path to your goal when giving a presentation is, what are you trying to teach? What's the message you're getting across? And I think, too, sort of this is a little bit repeating my last question, but there's got to be some actionable takeaways in there, too, I imagine. What does that look like? Do you leave people with, oh, you should use TypeScript as kind of that general, this is pretty cool, let's use a tool, versus you should use TypeScript in this way? I'm not sure how you're presenting that. So, tell us what that takeaway is as you approach it.
Sure. It really depends on the types of personas I think are going to be in the audience. But generally, I try to have a few different types of takeaways. For folks who have never played with the thing before, let's say the thing is TypeScript, I will give them links to just the Getting Started guide or the core language, TypeScriptLang.org documentation. For folks who have it and then want to get better at it, let's say I'll also have links for the nicer compiler options you can enable that are a little more strict and more beneficial at the cost of difficulty to work with. And then I always like having some sort of thought-provoking extra in there. Some sort of, if you really want to go out and explore, these are the cool topics you could learn about. So let's say asynchronous code defects, detecting them with static analysis is kind of the pinnacle there of what I think is really cool, and what I like seeing that little glimmer in the eyes of, ooh, that is nifty. So something that can get that glimmer up is always a good, cherry on top.
That's cool. When you see that, are there ways that you've seen at developer conferences to set this up? Have you seen security presentations that have managed to spark that glimmer, that they've been delivered in a way that gets an attention?
Yeah, there was an excellent presentation recently at a conference I was at in Timișoara, Romania. It was Revo.js, talking about how to kind of bridge that perceived divide between the security engineers. It was a great fellow named Benedict. And the way that he phrased a lot of the concerns, that it's not that we're on these two opposing camps and we're battling. It's that we have an overlapping Venn diagram set of goals, and we want to make sure that we're pushing in the same direction, that we're not, say, going really hard on security restrictions to the point of frustrating users, or going really hard on quick development to the point of introducing security vulnerabilities. That it's a cooperative sport, not a competitive sport between our areas. And I think that was kind of the glimmer in the eye for me of, yeah, that's how we should be thinking about it, that we're team players, cooperative, not competitive. So, yeah.
Do you have any issues going from this is a cool idea to talk about in a conference, is getting somebody just to use it continuously to not just put your idea on a shelf and ignore it? Because that's change. Yes. And change is evil.
Oh, yeah. And that's one of the downsides, I think, for me of conferences, that I go out and I espouse all these things and I have almost no way of following up to know whether anyone has done anything with them. So my hope is that, some non-trivial percentage of people do go out and do things. But at the end of the day, if they're at a conference, it's because they want something out of it, whether it's networking or new ideas or some other stuff. I'm trying to provide that for them. So I hope that if people are going to conferences, some amount of them are there for the new ideas and some amount of them will actually put them into practice. As to whether that happens, your guess is as good as mine.
Yeah. Unless somebody walks up and says, I want your help implementing this at my shop, you have no clue.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I will say, though, sorry, go ahead.
I said, do they ever ask you to come help them get it rolling in their shop?
Yeah. So for context, I'm full-time open source. I work on a lot of these tools. That's why I keep espousing the same three things, because I'm all excited about them. When I got started...
That's cool.
Yeah, when I got started, this was actually a consulting avenue. If I'd go talk online at conferences, and then once in a while I would get a gig, as they say, out of it. I think for me, one of the actual positive indicators is that I work in an area, linting, that people traditionally despise, to put it politely, that people don't like those little red, yellow squigglies in the editor. So seeing the level of vitriol decline over the last couple of years on Twitter and in person, I think has actually been a positive indicator for me, that a lot of folks, myself included, are pushing to use these tools properly, which means that folks are getting benefit instead of, or even in addition to, the pain with them.
Well, how has that, is there something you could point to, or a few things you would point to for that adoption to become healthier, more popular? Because I imagine you haven't just been repeating, please use my tool, please use my tool, please use my tool. You're describing about understanding some personas in an audience, understanding, removing user friction. So what have been some things you would point to that have had successful traction in getting that adoption?
There's a big discussion and debate at the very least, the JavaScript, TypeScript communities of whether you should use a linter for formatting. I personally have always described there as being a big separation, that a linter is not a good formatter and a formatter literally cannot lint. Not everyone agrees with that, and that's okay. There is an effort to make the standard JavaScript linter work for formatting. It gives you a bit more control. It's a whole thing. But a lot of people back in the day used a linter for formatting and then got the same squiggles, the same level of, you should fix this for little spacing errors as actual bugs, and also as stylistic complaints. So the community kind of learning from this iteratively, as communities tend to do, learning what the right way is, which is to separate those two areas, and what the wrong way is, which is to complain about them with equal severity. We learned that trains people to hate the linter, it trains people to ignore the linter, and generally turns them away from the tool. So I think over time we learned, and now we phrase things in a way that prioritizes what's actually important to people, which has been, I think, hugely beneficial for getting folks to lint their code.
And phrase things that are actually important to people sounds like a general rule to learn from for many types of tools. So I'm curious, do you see in this uptake of linters, are there other tools, other approaches that you would also wish to see have that same adoption path?
Yeah. Let's talk about security. So there's automatic scanning of dependencies. Let's say you have an NPM or NuGet registry backing behind your project, let's say, and then some automation is set up to let you know when there's any vuln reported on any of the packages that you transitively depend on. And in a lot of ecosystems, especially JavaScript, you end up having thousands upon thousands of packages.
Good
and
luck.
then your developers get flooded with these vulnerabilities of things that are not actually impactful to you. So there are companies like Socket.dev that are going out there and learning from this, iteratively figuring out what is important, what isn't, how do we classify. And I think it's followed an interestingly similar pattern where the community sets up this awesome new tool. We use it way too much, or at least in ways that it's not designed for, as a method of learning where we should or shouldn't use it. We go through that cycle, the Gartner hype cycle, and then we hit that plateau of productivity at the end, which is the most exciting part, I think, to see.
That's funny because I was wondering too about, the iteration over time of just how we approach things. We're learning. I have a little bit of frustration. It seems we learn so slowly though. And I'm curious if and this is one of the reasons I wanted to bring you on and talk about the communication, because I like the idea of AppSec actually going out to developers, talking to them. So along the lines of iterating, there's a feedback loop there. What if more security folks came to developer conferences? Let me turn it around and say, what types of presentations do you wish the AppSec folks would listen to for them to be in the audience for?
I'm trying to think about what the shared concerns are, the things that are relevant to both of us, and especially the things that we work on together. So right off the bat, there's the interpersonal communication. And I want to be very clear here. I am not accusing AppSec people of being better or worse than other
we'll get
areas
mail anyway.
at this.
Sorry,
it's
Josh.
just a shared concern we all need.
Yeah.
Oh, well. You insult some people on a Monday. It's just how these podcasts go. So that's always a really, really good area. And then learning how the frameworks work, I think, is also really nice. A lot of ecosystems are going through upheaval now, especially on the web. We have server side versus client side versus all these different strategies for rendering. I've attended a few talks from the .NET side talking about Blazor that are just fascinating. So understanding how each side, let's say the developer side, thinks about architecting can be really useful just for setting up where we should be prioritizing effort. But I would also flip that and say, if developers intended more AppSec things, I would have the same request. Attend the interpersonal stuff, see how we, should or could be communicating, and then how AppSec is architected. Like, where are the types of areas that we can fill in? How are the holes being plugged security wise? That would be also really useful for us.
As you're saying that, I'm thinking, is there any value to, like say in my shop, as a security guy, walking down the hall to the developers to have them just show me what they do without judgment, right? Show me how they put an app together. For me, I guess it's hard to keep the brain in check, right? To take it as input. But I was thinking we were both talking about better understanding each other, aren't we?
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. Within the constraint of who has time for anything. I mean, it can be hard to find time for that, but it's valuable. And if you can advocate for it at work that, hey, we did this, we got these good learnings out of it, and try to schedule that into your product development lifecycle, that can be hugely beneficial.
And I think too, there's ways of I'm going to try not to use the word framing, but there's ways of curating that conversation, leading that conversation. So it starts off to Lee's point, what are you building? But then, and we don't have to skip straight to the threat modeling of, oh, what could go wrong, but more of just that interest. Well, how did you handle, tell me more about how you're handling authorization, or help me understand that design choice you made for this architecture. I'm speaking a little bit abstract, but those help me understand, tell me more, and picking on perhaps an authorization, because that's pretty big, or state management, another pretty big opinionated area, or even just the data model. How are you handling data? Where is it being encrypted? You don't even need to get to those areas of threat modeling. It's just having that conversation. And if you notice too, I avoided anything from that top 10 list. It's not like, well, what are you doing about SSRF? How are you dealing with IDOR? What are you dealing with cross-site scripting? And I see, thankfully, Lee shaking his head, because, those I think are the boring ways to engage, honestly, ourselves as well as developers. So, let's have those conversations that are meaningful to learn something, I think is how I would try to concisely put that.
I'm flashing back to conversations I've had with the young developer who's got all the new stuff they want to do. They can't sit in their chair. They're so excited. They're bouncing. That guy or gal, I'm sure. Maybe we may have been that person once in our lives. Finding out what's really got their attention and actually listening to what it does. It's amazing, the stuff they're coming up with. And then we can talk about how they think it's secure and go back to our 10 list on our own, but ask first, right? Seek to understand. Sorry for the cliche.
No, but I think it's yeah, go ahead, Josh. Okay, I was going to say, sometimes it's very helpful just to position that conversation as not a lecture, as more of, I'm here on the AppSec side to learn. Maybe we did start talking about developer conferences, presentations in general. This is sort of the small one-on-one version of that, if you will. Part of what we've also been talking about, I mentioned, the anti-patterns, the cliches we do want to destroy, like developers don't care. Josh, you were pointing out, people are constrained by time, so let's prioritize and understand how people prioritize. We are a week after Halloween, and I love Halloween, so I still want to squeeze in sort of a Halloween-themed question here, in the sense of, Josh, what's a zombie topic that you wish would just stay dead, that we could keep buried, perhaps?
Oh boy. There's a classification of discussions or presentations that I despise, which is X is absolutist adjective. X is best, or Y is worst. Over in the front end space, it's whether Tailwind CSS is the devil or our savior, or whether, I don't know, Ruby on Rails is the only acceptable way to build a full stack, whatever. There's a reason why we have so many different technologies, and they're all learning and growing from each other. So I think it's intellectually shallow to claim that one thing is the best for all given situations. You're not a real dev unless you XYZ. That's foolish. There are many different pros and cons for every different tool. Yeah.
Yeah, and one of the things too is even on this show, I will make fun of Perl at any opportunity. But other than that, we're pretty agnostic, or at least I'm pretty agnostic to languages. We do talk about, of course, memory safety issues. So pick on the C and C++ of the world. But we also find some vulns that are examples from the parsing errors in Go or in Rust. You can still have memory safe languages that do unsafe things, just in different domains. So I very much appreciate that idea that there's nuance to discussions. That's a wonderful thing. I'm curious, Josh, just to give you the benefit of the mic here now that we have you. That's a great topic. Is there another one, or is there anything else on that list of things that you wish would stay buried?
There's another. For me, I see patterns, and I dislike the patterns because I don't have the memory capacity for specific titles. But I don't like the pattern of, it's the same thing as a decade ago X. Like in front-end space, people are pooping all over about how, oh my God, Next.js and Remix, it's just PHP all over again, completely disregarding the decade plus of innovation that we've had that went into them, and how it's actually a completely different paradigm, being able to render on the client and or the server. It's very interesting, very new. But people see these quick little descriptions and go, oh, it's the same thing, which frustrates me. It's not the same, gosh dang it.
So As we're talking about dead languages, as it were, where do you see the push to change, coming from? Is it coming from the security folks? Is it coming from the developers? And do they really understand what it's like to take, whatever legacy and rewrite it in Golang or insert? I don't care. It's the general question. Is there enough understanding, and where does it come from?
It's a great question. I think there are a lot of different vectors of push here. One of them is that language designers are constantly making better languages. It's an incredibly good investment if you're a Google, let's say, to create or help create something like Go. There are also developers who are frustrated. A lot of things are pain reactions. I have a lot of issues, let's say security or bugs from writing in C++. So I would like to switch over to Go. There is, of course, always a downside of switching over, the cost and time, you might not be as familiar. So it's not always a strong, pure positive. There are also the hobbyists who just want to learn cool things. I mean, Go has a beautiful way of representing error states. I'm not saying whether it's better or worse than others in certain situations, but it's a very intellectually stimulating one. I don't know if I can answer that question completely. That's a very good question.
And that's interesting.
What do you think?
I was going to add to that. Just I don't know that I could answer that question. It's a really good one where where the source of the change is coming from, but maybe example evidence of such changes too. Even in Rust was a while back. It got really good feedback about its debugging. Feedback about what it shows from the debugger. And if you've ever done C++ programming, especially metaprogramming, and see a template error, you suddenly have 15 pages of scrolling by that are inscrutable. That LLVM has done a little bit better job about that, but giving just better feedback from the tools. I think I'm using that perhaps as a poor metaphor to respond to what Lee is doing, where we've seen Lee's question, where we've seen some of the tools just respond better to what developers need as humans. Like, I need to read this as a human. I would like to see that red squiggly line, but give it to me in the sense of context or that's meaningful rather than I just have two spaces instead of one. Josh, we are always ourselves constrained by time, but we don't necessarily want to let you off too quickly. You've been talking about developer conferences as an abstract. Do you have any favorites where you would love to see more AppSec people apply to, give presentations at? What would be some good developer conferences that you'd encourage us to come to?
I always struggle with this kind of question because I don't want to leave any great conferences out.
Fair point.
I think some of the more fun, wacky ones I've seen have been in the City.js and the half-stack lines. Those have a lot of really cool ones. There was one talk from from half-stack last year, a performer stage named Earth to Abigail. Almost no speaking in this talk. It was just algorithmically generated pseudo-random song music. It was incredible. I think recently I've been really enjoying Eastern European conferences. So Revo.js, DevReach. I don't know how that ended up being my recent phase. And then the JS Conf line is great. That has a lot of the really solid folks. So JS Conf IE, JS Conf Japan. Right now I am sitting in a hotel in between events and days in a conference right now. So I of course have to recommend NodeConf EU, but it's also a great conference. I'm learning a lot about Node.js. And then I'm really excited for Way Web for me in 2 weeks, which is in Spain. Never been to it before, but it's got a great lineup, and I'm really excited.
Fun. Thanks for that list. And I'll definitely have to.
I'll stop.
I'll have to throw a bunch of those into the show notes. That's a wonderful one, and I love the fact that it's not the Black Hat Steph Cons B-sides, which have a very important purpose to them. So once again, trying to add nuance here. What the focus here is to find the conferences where AppSec hasn't historically been present, and let's make ourselves more present there. But that's my pitch, but we can't end on my notes here. Josh, you're the guest. We always ask our guests, as you know, to describe AppSec in 3 words. And I'm curious how your response to this may be changing over the year that you've been on with us.
Oh yeah. It gets harder to answer each time. I've answered with plug the gaps and don't mess up. Let's say do it better. I haven't thought about this one very much, and I don't want there to be a condescending tone there, but I think we're always learning newer and better ways to let's say, plug the gaps, to write safe, secure code. So part of the excitement for me in hanging out with y'all, this area that I don't actually work in, is that I get to learn a lot and see how the industry, from your perspective, is learning and growing.
And we thank you, because do it better requires some feedback as well. So we're getting feedback from you just to figure out what does it take to iterate for us to talk with developers. And
cool. I should, by the way, I should also shout out 2 more conference series, React Miami and Seattle JS, both great conferences that I immediately regretted not mentioning initially. Sorry.
I'm sure we'll get more email about the others that you didn't mention, but listeners, please know that he did regret mentioning them. Thank you, Josh, for demonstrating the constructive way to approach this type of conversation. So thank you for joining us once again this year.
No, thank you for having me. This is always a pleasure.
Thank you, Lee, as well. Thank you to all of our listeners. There's some more links to the show notes, to Josh's work and the presentations he's given, as well as some of the ones he's liked as well. So I encourage everyone to go check that link out. We're going to take a quick break now and return with news of the week.